Hello and welcome. It's funny how the exact same story can sound completely different depending on who's telling it. Well, that is especially true when we talk about the history of modern India. Today, we're going to peel back the layers and see how this incredible story can be viewed through some radically different lenses.
So here's what we've got on tap. We're going to start by kind of blowing up the idea that history is just a bunch of facts. Then we'll dive into the first huge debate, the empire versus the nation. After that, we'll see how newer thinkers started poking holes in both of those stories, and we'll look at some even more specific, focused ways of seeing the past. And finally, we'll wrap it all up by figuring out what this all means for you and me.
All right, let's get into our first big idea, and it's a crucial one. History isn't just about what happened. It's about who is telling the story of what happened. I mean, think about it. We're often taught that history is this fixed timeline, right? A bunch of objective truths. But is it really? The truth is, every single history book you read is an interpretation. It's a story that's been put together by a real person, someone with their own biases, their own point of view, and their own reasons for telling it. And this brings us to a really important word for today, historiography. It sounds a little academic, but all it means is the history of history. So instead of just looking at the events, we're looking at the historians. What lens are they using? What questions are they asking? What's going on in the world while they're writing? It's how we uncover the story behind the story.
Okay, with that idea in our back pocket, let's jump into the first major clash of historical narratives in modern India. You can think of this as a head-to-head debate between the British rulers and the Indian nationalists.
So on one side, you have the colonial approach, and you've got to remember who was writing this stuff, mostly British officials and administrators, so their histories had a pretty clear agenda, to make British rule look not just good, but absolutely necessary. They often painted this picture of India as this unchanging, stagnant place that desperately needed saving. This is where you get ideas like the white man's burden, this whole notion that the British were doing India a favor by bringing peace, unity, and so-called civilization.
And then, as a direct comeback, the nationalist approach was born. Now, this school of thought had its own agenda, right? To build a sense of national pride and unity, to get people fired up for the freedom struggle. So these writers flipped the script. They focused on how exploitative the colonial rule really was, and they shone a huge spotlight on India's amazing achievements long before the British ever showed up. It was a powerful way to reclaim their own story. And when you put them side by side like this, it is just night and day. For the colonial writers, the heroes of the story are British administrators. But for the nationalists, the heroes are the Indian people and their leaders, fighting back. It's the exact same time period, but these are two completely different, totally opposing stories. But of course, the conversation didn't just end there. Around the middle of the 20th century, a new wave of thinkers came along and said, hold on a second, maybe both of these stories are missing something. They started asking some tough new questions about class and power. Take the Marxist approach. For historians like R.P. Dutt, the big story wasn't just about nation versus empire, it was about economics and class struggle. Sure, they saw the main conflict as the colonial masters versus the Indian people, but, and this is so important, they also pointed their microscope inside Indian society. They wanted to talk about the conflicts between Indian capitalists and Indian workers, between landlords and peasants, arguing the national movement was largely led by the middle and upper classes. And then came the Subaltern school, and they were a total game changer. They basically looked at everyone, the colonial writers, the nationalists, even the Marxists, and said, you are all telling history from the top down. This is all elitist history. Their entire mission was to find the voice of the everyday person, the subaltern. They made this radical claim that there wasn't just one freedom movement, there were two, an official elite one and a whole separate popular movement of the masses who often had very different ideas and goals. And this quote right here from Bipin Chandra just perfectly captures how explosive this was. He's pointing out that these weren't just quiet academic debates, they were real, passionate arguments. The Subaltern school literally threw down the gauntlet and challenged pretty much everything that had been written before, completely changing the way Indian history was studied.
And that new trend that Bipin Chandra talked about really opened the floodgates. Historians started using even more specialized lenses, zooming in on all sorts of other forces that shape the past, things like personal ambition, religious identity, and of course, gender. So, take the Cambridge School. They came in with a pretty provocative idea. They argued that what looked like this big, unified fight for freedom was actually, a lot of the time, more like a bunch of local competitions.
Indians competing against other Indians for the jobs, the status, and the benefits that the British system made available. From this perspective, politics was driven less by grand ideology and more by self-interest and local power struggles. It really complicates that simple picture of a united front against the empire.
Next up, you have the communalist approach. This one sees India's history primarily through the lens of religious conflict, especially between Hindus and Muslims. This interpretation suggests that the interests of these two communities were fundamentally and permanently opposed to each other. It basically draws a straight line from medieval conflicts all the way to the 20th century, arguing that religious identity was the single most powerful force driving history.
And then, starting around the 1970s, feminist historiography came along and asked a question that was somehow overlooked for centuries. Hey, where are all the women in these stories? This whole approach is about writing women back into the historical narrative. Not just to see what roles they played, but to analyze how colonialism, new laws, and even nationalism itself had a unique and specific impact on women's lives. Stories that had been almost totally invisible before.
Whew. Okay, so we have looked at a whole bunch of different ways to tell the story of modern India. So what? What's the big takeaway here? Why should any of this matter to you? Well, if you remember one thing from our time together today, let it be this. History is never just a simple list of facts. It is always an interpretation. It's always shaped by the storyteller's lens, their politics, their ideology, the time they're living in. Knowing about all these different approaches doesn't mean you have to pick a favorite. No, it's about something much more powerful. It gives you the tools to be a smarter, more critical reader of the past. It teaches you to always be asking questions. Who wrote this? Why did they write it? What evidence are they highlighting? And more importantly, what are they leaving out? What's their ultimate goal? Because once you start understanding the storyteller, that's when you really truly start to understand the story itself.